Then I think I am, in fact, ready to go. All right. Let's do it, Hop.
It's on you, brother. Welcome for you.
All right. Welcome, everyone. This is Bill Trent. I hope your visuals are good. We have a very special opportunity today, and it is a double treat for me. One, because I know that I will leave this meeting intellectually challenged, and I will have learned many new things. And that's because of the scholarship and the person that David Stovall is. For those of you who are not aware, David is a professor in 3 different departments at the University of Illinois at Chicago. He is an outstanding scholar and contributor in all of those ways. But one of the things that distinguishes David from any number of scholars who attend to these issues of diversity, racism, and injustice is that David actually puts himself in the midst of it, especially when it comes to the education of young people. He has worked assiduously within the school system to be able to bring a difference to the students in the Chicago schools. And his lesson has been adopted by many others, but perhaps not with the success that David has brought. So we are fortunate to have one of our alum return to us today to share with us his passion for addressing these issues and the strategies and understandings and insights that have propelled his work. Without further ado, I give you David Stovall. Professor Stovall, the floor is yours.
Definitely. Thank you so much, Dr. Trent. For folks who don't know, this is kind of full circle for me. I have been able to come back to Urbana in numerous capacities, whether it be being on folks' committees as a committee member, and then working with groupings of young folks at the Urbana campus. So it's always a blessing, and to be introduced by your advisor, and then living in recognition of his work and Jim Anderson's work in making sure that folks like myself were even allowed into a place like a graduate program. So thank you again. It's truly a blessing to be here. And thanks to Dr. Rodney Hobson for even thinking about somebody like myself to be engaged in something like this. And before I begin, I want to thank everyone who is in attendance today for surviving the 3 pandemics of white supremacy, capitalism, and COVID-19. I think it's important to put that in our conversation, because when we do, we also recognize what it is that we have gone through and how tough it's been. And I think it's important to start with that, because in many spaces, when we don't recognize the challenges of the moment, we are remiss to even engage how we got here. Right. So I think it's critically important for us to engage not only how we got here, but what it means to be in a land founded on slavery, genocide, and wrongful land appropriation. So this COVID moment, or this pandemic, now just highlights what many of us have known for quite some time. And now that larger members of the population have become aware of this particular issue, it now does not diffuse or dilute what folks have been saying pre this particular moment. I'm saying it to you all from Chicago, in a land that we are all in, which was part of the Council of 3 Fires, where 15 plus Indigenous nations created a federation to fight white supremacy. I think it's important to acknowledge the numerous nations that exist and existed in the area known as Illinois and the Midwest. So I think it's critically important to talk about, when we talk about engagement and we talk about community engagement and authentic community engagement as a way to understand and combat structural racism, I think there's some things that we have to bring to the table. And some of those things are hard challenges to university spaces. And when we engage in those hard challenges, it allows us to begin to think about our work in a different way. And one of those ways is to push this envelope in terms of what do we actually mean by community engagement? Because we can be quick to brochure folks, right? We can have a particular brochure and the brochure has folks, and now you got the smiling babies on the brochure and everybody thinks that you're actually doing something. But actually what we need to consider is what harm has been brought to those particular communities. And now to what extent are you in whatever capacity willing to address that harm? And one of the things that we have to confront with is this historical colonial relationship that universities have had to communities of color. And we have to be clear around what it means to interrupt those relationships. So one of the first things is really asking this question: what are we actively doing to interrupt the colonial, historical, exploitative relationship that universities have had with community spaces that's in tune with these particular spaces of white supremacist racist notions around the deficit of communities of color? Now, it's critically important for me to start with this and to say, when I'm talking about white supremacy, I need to be specific here, because white racialized acts of terror are only one part of white supremacy. We need to understand white supremacy akin to capitalism as a totalizing system, and a totalizing system that is based on the assumed beliefs, views, and values of white, Western European, cisgendered, heterosexual, able-bodied Christian males as normal, right, and good. And I think when we start to confront that, it allows us to understand January 6th in a very different light. So if you understand white supremacy as these assumed beliefs and values, and now that those assumed beliefs and values appear to have become threatened, now people begin to engage in a very different way. And now when you see the events like January 6th, it makes sense to understand that now people would much rather believe a lie than come to grips with what we've currently known and have known for quite some time in relationship to the place in which we reside, being founded on genocide, slavery, and wrongful land appropriation. And it's important to put that out there because in too many instances, we run away from that. And when people bring it up, people think that we're just starting mess. Well, to that I say, we have to think about the mess first. And now when we think about the mess, now we have to think about the ways in which we are either acquiescing to the mess or we are refuting and interrupting and willing to abolish the things that the mess has created. And now when we begin to talk about this, and you begin to talk about community engagement, especially in university spaces, I'm always deeply worried, right? Because we've seen what this has meant over time. We've seen the experimentation on Black and brown people by university hospitals. We've seen the ways that universities in the early 20th century and into the 21st century has actually experimented on folks who were incarcerated. I mean, these are spaces that were actually birthed in universities, right? So when you read folks like Jonathan Metzl, when he talks about a protest psychosis and this idea of schizophrenia becoming a Black disease, that largely comes from university bodies. So now when we start to think about the ways in which the university is saying that it is engaging with folks, the question I always have is, one, who are you engaging? Two, what is the extent of that engagement? And then three, to what extent are the issues and concerns of that particular community highlighted as central to the analysis of what it is that you're doing? And I think this becomes important because a lot of folks want to feel like they're doing good, right? Nobody wants to be the racist, Klan-bearing, cross-burning person going into Black and brown spaces, right?
Right.
But at the same time, you can have the same affect if you're not careful.
Yeah.
So now, when you're pushing against this, if you're pushing against this, and this is kind of hard for university folks to grapple with, because we have to come to grips with what our research traditionally teaches us, right? So research that's based in the Western Enlightenment tradition of Europe talks to us always about being distant from the spaces that we engage.
Yes.
But a radical imaginary of research says, well, what does it mean to be close and responsible?
Mm-hmm.
How do you do your work with integrity? And then if you do your work with integrity, now who is the arbiter of this, right? So it's not you saying that you do good work. It is literally being in a space understanding that the community determines whether or not you're doing good work.
Exactly.
And even more importantly, the community should have the capacity to remove you if you are not. So now, what does it mean to have those memorandums of understanding that are pushing us to say, we know what traditionally has happened here. Now, what will we actively do to not repeat that? But more importantly, what are the stated issues and concerns of these spaces? And then how do we start with those first? In many instances, especially in universities, we will look at the data and then tell a school district, here's where your problem is.
Mm-hmm.
And before we actually talk to folks and say, all right, our data is telling us one thing. Is there another story here? The data only gives us one entree into the actual happenings of that place.
Let me talk to you for a minute about that, David, because I think this is a very critical point. With so many universities signing on to the idea of pursuing a social justice model,
Mm-hmm.
what's your advice with respect to how they get to that point of recognizing that there is a long-standing trust issue that must be addressed? What has been your experience in addressing that? What do we need to understand is the challenge of addressing the need to establish that trust? I won't say reestablish, because it makes the assumption that it was once there.
Right.
I think we have to address the idea that we have to understand and engage knowing that there is a trust issue to be addressed.
Right. And I think one of my colleagues, Marvin Lynn, when he was up here at UIC, did this best, right? So when he would approach schools in Chicago public schools, he would literally start his conversation with, given the history of the University of Illinois at Chicago and its relationship to neighborhood public schools, there is no good reason for you to trust me, right? I mean, he starts with that.
Yes.
Right? And then he says, because there isn't, my accountability is to you first before my institution. And I am willing to engage what the terms and conditions of that accountability is before I start any work in your particular schools, right? And I think that changes up how you approach things, because now it's you saying, look, we know what this is. And I don't want to sugarcoat anything. I want to come in with that. And because I start with that, now it instantaneously pushes us to what's the terms of agreement and what are the issues. So now you have created this thing to hold fast to. And then to go even further, to say, if it is ever a moment where you all feel that the terms and agreements have been violated by the university, you can stop this work at any given time, right? It changes up, it changes up the parameters. It literally says, because we do this in qualitative research, right? So qualitative research in the Black tradition says, look, at any given moment that this is not sounding right, we need to stop it right now, right? There's nothing, you do not need to reveal anything that you are not comfortable in revealing to someone who is using this in a place that you do not know about, right? So I think those things become critically important, and you have to start with those. Like, those aren't these kind of randomized spaces that you just kind of have to show IRB, right? This is beyond the IRB, right? This is beyond institutional review or research subjects. This is beyond that space. This is saying the responsibility I have in working with people is one that has to be done with integrity and fidelity, right? And now I am not the arbiter of what counts for those things. And now communities, if they think that I am in violation, they think I need to go, then I have to go, right? And I think that type of work puts you in a different position, right? And it puts you in a space to say, I am no longer interested in doing what Eve Tuck refers to as damage-based research, right? I'm not interested in saying this is how terrible things are, but I am interested in saying, here's what folks are faced with. Here are the conditions that deeply contribute to this thing that folks are faced with. And here's what we're willing to do to engage to improve conditions, right? And the final judgment on that is not at the university, it's not at the federal level, it's not at the state level, it's not even at the local level. It's at the ground level at that particular schoolhouse, community center, or space where we're working in community with folks. And I think those types of things, to the earlier point, it runs counter to what we traditionally understand to be the commitment and values that are withheld in research, right? So it's really around, I think community engagement is challenging you up front to oppose those things that have traditionally exploited and isolated communities even further. But to now say, if we're going to do this, there has to be a commitment to change and shift conditions. And one more thing in that is long-term work, right? You're no longer talking about the work in the scope of the grant, right? I got $25,000 for 2 years to do X. Okay, when that's done, are you leaving or you gonna continue to do that work, right? And I think that's really important. So we're talking about the development of long-term relationships, right? So anything that we enter, we have to be willing to be there long-term, in opposed to, just looking at research dollars for the terms of whatever we wrote in the grant.
Thank you, David. Let me take just a second. I have questions, as you might expect, that have been raised by the panelists, and we have those questions hopefully ready to bombard you with. So let me just take a moment and get back to that particular page. Let me start actually with the question that was put into the chat box. And the question is, could Dr. Stovall speak to Pell coming back for folks in prison and new and or ramped up education programs and any issues, challenges you might see in that?
Definitely. And thanks for that question, because I think this is key when we talk about authentic engagement, right? So for people who are unfamiliar, Pell Grants, and for folks who are familiar with Illinois, the state of Illinois for 3 years did not have a budget, and this was under Bruce Rauner. And when the state did not have a budget, Pell Grants, which were grants for low-income Black and Latinx students that they could use for anything from tuition fees or books, was eliminated. So now in folks bringing back Pell Grants and having those available for folks who are on the inside, or people refer to as incarcerated, I think it becomes critically important to bring those back, because in the 70s, you actually had folks who were on the inside who were able to get bachelor's degrees and advanced degrees. So now in bringing that back, I think there's another point. So we should definitely have that Pell system back, and folks who are on the inside should be eligible. Now, a lot of times people say, well, if somebody has committed a crime, then they should be, all of those things should be forfeit. And for that, I go to the work of Miriam Kaba, who always says, look, there are no perfectly innocent nor perfectly guilty people. And if a person is making the attempt to change their condition and to do something different, then we should always be in support of that, right? That is the first practice, one of the first spaces to understand in abolition, right? So if you are ending a practice that is based in isolation and containment and white supremacy, now you have to think about, what are you trying to build? So now with folks having access to Pell Grants, folks being able to bring back degree programs to folks who are on the inside. And then something that I think the question is also connected to: the state of Illinois does not have a parole system. There's a strange relationship to this. Illinois has what's called supervised release, and it's different from parole because you don't have the arbiter that says, okay, this was not a parole violation, or we can make adjustments to the terms of parole to make sure that folks can do whatever it is they need to do. And largely this is around, house confinement, being able to work late night hours or what have you. So now the state of Illinois, in addition to bringing Pell Grants back and having folks on the inside being able to use those, is also connected to bringing back a system of parole where folks, if they get out, now are able to attend colleges and universities without those particular constraints. And the adjustment will be able to be made given their terms and conditions. Now, again, this is more of a non-reformist reform in relationship to the prison industrial complex. And when people talk about abolition, one of the steps to abolition is to engage these non-reformist reforms. And the idea is to get folks in a space where they no longer have to have contact with the prison industrial complex. So I see that Pell Grant situation and the challenges therein directly connected to a state like Illinois that no longer has a parole system. So those things are deeply connected, and I think speak to one another when we talk about access to higher education to folks on the inside.
Very good. Thank you, David. Thank you very much for your response there. Do you need a glass of water or anything? Take a moment.
No, I'm good.
You're good? Okay.
We in motion.
Very good. David, one of the words that and ideas that comes up in many questions regarding this work that you do and the work that needs to be done is the issue of sustainability. One of the things we know is that, and you said it earlier, and in your opening comments, you've got to be there for not just the fun times, but you've got to be there for the hard work times, and you've got to be there throughout the effort. Could you comment on that, please?
Yeah, I think there are a couple of things that happen, right? So one thing is really around writing. So when folks get into the non-for-profit industrial complex or whatever, the philanthropic or large funding agencies have. One is to think about writing those particular grants for longer periods of time, but also thinking about what does it mean to do the work when the grant money runs out, right? And I think this really is important when we talk about sustainability. And a lot of times when people do this work, so I work with a group of folks in California, and they have been working inside of schools for now 20 years. And one of the folks who directs that program, and it's the Pinoy Educational Partnerships, her name is Alison Santiago Cubales. She always says to the schools that she works with, she says, look, I'm here as long as you want me here. And if there comes a moment where, you feel like our work is no longer needed, then we'll deal with that as it comes. But I think those types of long-term arrangements that are not tied to research dollars or grant money becomes important. Now, to your point, Doc, this is antithetical to what people may have in a tenure track position, right? Because you may be, you're rewarded or congratulated or promoted based on your securing of these particular grant dollars. So we have to think about that differently, because there's the occupation of the professoriate, but then there's the work that you're doing in community with folks. And there's, of course, some intersection and overlap, but I think when we become solely committed to the conventions of the institution, it makes it that much more difficult for us to really engage what folks are trying to do. So that sustainability is really us thinking about, okay, what do we do when there is no money? Like, that has to be part of our plan, right?
Yes.
So when the money runs out, what is it that we're willing to do, right? Will we try to re-up? Will we just do our work in a different way? How are we now utilizing the resources at our disposal that may not be grant money, but other things like research assistantships, course releases, all of these things to now think about how to support the work. So it's really around us thinking about this fugitively, right? Really saying, okay, here's what we got, here's what we're trying to do, and here's how we're trying to make it work. I think that allows us to think about our work sustainably, right, in terms of what it is that we're doing. And then the last part of that is, how do we train folks up to replace us?
Yes.
Right. I think that's a really important piece that the Academy in particular does a horrible job at, right? So this thing around, how do we now set up instances where we can train folks up to do similar work and actually take that work in a direction that they feel is most viable? I think that is really the project of sustainability in terms of replacing ourselves and then thinking about our work long term.
Thank you. This is really important, because so many of the places that we're involved with as faculty are places that are not organizationally structured to do this work. And I really fundamentally appreciate that point. A question from the registration. These are folks who found out that you were going to be here and decided, I got to get my question in. How can faculty be braver in supporting Black and Indigenous people of color and students who face discrimination? For example, within student teaching placements.
Excellent.
That's how the question came. All right.
Exactly. This is an excellent question. I think this is key, right? Because when we talk about, because again, when we talk about teaching, let's be clear and intentional. You do not get a profession that is 80% white and female by accident. You have to ask questions as to how this has come to be. Right. And you also have to ask questions around how people are assessed to maintain that particular demographic population. right? So we have to be clear about that, right? So when you got Ed TPA and they got you taping your class and then you sending it off to somebody who has no idea the context of what you teach, and then that's the main arbiter of the space. You say to yourself, well, what the hell am I in? And then you got to pay them $300 to do it, right? So, I'm a Chicagoan. We don't call that educational assessment. That's extortion, right? I mean, we got to be clear. Like, we got to be clear about that. So now, if you're committed to this, you have to be even clearer about where you're doing your student teacher placements.
Yes.
You got to be clear about what classrooms you got folks in, right? So you can't just ask the principal, okay, who needs a student teacher? No, you have to say, okay, who in the schoolhouse is really doing innovative things with their students, who understands the ways in which white supremacy functions and now have demonstrated how they support Black, Indigenous, and Latinx students. That has to be the litmus. And now, back to our earlier point, you have to have long-term relationships with these places, right? Teacher placement just becomes a scramble, right? You just scraping it's this warm body syndrome, right? You just trying to scrape to put folks in certain spaces. No, you have to be intentional around who you are placing students with, how they're getting into that space, how are they being supported. So you can't have them in spaces where people don't understand this, right? You got to be intentional around that placement and then thinking about that long term. I think that's critical, because the real tea in all of this is it's not so much the data of teachers leave in the first 3 years. The majority of teachers leave in year 1. Yes. So now, if you're trying to interrupt that, you got to say, okay, who are our parent folks with, right? And now that becomes, and that's building long-lasting relationships.
Yes,
right?
It is.
You're not putting folks in spaces of further precarity. Yeah. You have to be intentional about that. We actually got, you all got an alumni down there in Champaign. One of the homies, I don't know if he's on the webinar today, but by the name of Jamie Roundtree. Yep. Jamie Roundtree is a principal, and now, when you're talking to him about what's happening, he's going to tell you directly, and he's going to say, here are the folks who know what they're doing, and now we can support a student teacher and pairing them with somebody who knows what this is. I think that teacher placement thing becomes critically important, and you cannot go to this warm body syndrome. I don't care what you do. You have to be intentional about who you are placing pre-service teachers with, right? Yes. And because that could be the launching pad to doing something great, or you could relaunch the Colonial Project, right?
That's exactly right. Yes.
So I think you have to be clear about that. I appreciate that question, because we can't run from that. And we do too much of that scrambling in opposed to setting up long-term relationships with folks who know what they're doing and love on our young folks. I think that's key.
Thank you. Thank you very, very much. I have a question here that I think came in more recently, and that is, can you talk about how educational systems can pay reparations to Black and Indigenous families?
Right, and I think when we talk about the reparations movement, everybody makes this mistake that people think about it just being, Black and Indigenous folks just getting a check. And that's not it, right? You're talking about addressing structural harm.
Right.
So now if you think about addressing structural harm, if you think about the places where young folks are being harmed, schools are one of them. Mm-hmm. So now you have to think about, in what ways can schools operate potentially as viable mechanisms for communities who have historically experienced exclusion, isolation, and containment in them. Mm-hmm. And that's a tall order, right? Yeah. In terms of thinking about this in particular ways, because, some people who engage in Afro-pessimism, and some people who are just critical historians say, well, look, schooling was never meant to educate folks, right? It was to keep them in a system of order and compliance.
Right. Right.
So now the question becomes, if we think about reparations, can schools operate as a place where people can be educated, right? And that's an ideological question, that's a material question, and that's one that gets us to think about structural racism and the long-term effects of it. So I learned that from you a while ago, Doc, in terms of talking about the vestiges of white supremacy.
Right.
So when we start to think about the vestiges of white supremacy, now, how do they play themselves out in schools? And now, as to repair, right? So reparations as repair for the harm.
Yes.
Now, what are we willing to do, right? And that goes to everything from the training and preparation of teachers, that goes to our content and materials, that goes to how we engage pedagogy, that goes to how we structure schools. And dare we say, because this is the one thing that becomes super hard, how we train school leaders, right?
Yes.
Because that's the thing, because we can do a lot in terms of creating justice-centered educators, right? K-12. But when it gets to the leadership point, now you become more of a compliance officer than you do someone who is standing for justice, right? So the principal's large responsibility to the district is more compliance than it is to do right by its students, right?
That's a very important point. We have a colleague, a faculty member you may remember, who was in the college, just did a book on Schoolhouse Blues. It's a brand new piece. And she does an ethnographic study of an African-American male. And she walks us through the eyes of this Black male student. She walks us through how he experiences school and gives us insights into the stages and processes and how they impact that child. It's a book that I recommend, especially anyone who wants to be a teacher in today's schools. They should have this book. The question that I have about just the points you were making is a question that came in with registration also. What are the typical mistakes that we often make when we move into the space of being activists, changing schools? In addition to the ones you've identified, what are the more typical likely mistakes that we're going to actually encounter?
Yeah, I think one of the most typical classic, if we can use that kind of terminology, mistakes is that we know something. Right? I mean, I think that's the thing, right? You're going into a space that you have no relationship to. You looked at some data and now you know something. Like that's just antithetical to what we know actually works in spaces, right? So I think the thing is, you may have a particular skill set as a researcher, right? You can ask a particular set of questions. Now the point becomes, what are you asking these questions for, right? And now, if you're asking these questions to now figure out what's happening, you actually see a loop into another set of questions, right? And I think that's always the mistake, right? Academics are quick to, because 5 people said you wrote some long shit about some little shit that now you know something. It's like, come on, man, quit playing. Like, what are we doing? And I think we have to stop that there and say, look, I love Gwendolyn Brooks. One of my mentors, Bill Ayers, always uses this quote from Gwendolyn Brooks when she talks about the Black arts movement and Black poetry. She says, I appreciate the contributions of young people because they remind me that I am in the kindergarten of my understanding.
Wow.
Right? So I mean, for me, that's the thing, right? If you are, the common mistake is that you know something, but what we really need to be understanding is that we are in the kindergarten of our understandings. We are just starting. And I think we get too blown up on our research skill set in opposed to our relation building skill set. And I think that becomes critically important. That is often the first and largest mistake.
Let me ask you to expand on that just a bit, and I'll be more faithful to the question as it was written, because it actually says, what are common errors that allies make?
Mm-hmm.
Which is slightly different. I mean, there are people who are hired to do the work in schools, but there are allies who are genuinely trying to address systemic racism.
Right. And I think that thing around, it just becomes a more nuanced process of listening.
Okay.
Because it's still the thing that and sometimes with allies, it can even be worse, right? Because now you think you know something, and now you think you're doing right by folks, right? And the whole thing is around, look, slow all that down,
yes.
Right? How do we understand what's happening here? And then how can we can only have those viable discussions because we are in relationship with folks, right? And I think that really becomes important. Like I remember in Champaign in the late 90s, when the district got sued, and there was a Rockford case right before that. And there was a longtime community activist named John Lee Johnson, who was like, hold on, wait, y'all. We told y'all this a long time ago, right? And now you can't come into space and say, now we got the answers. No, that's just not working. This thing around is, look, what is happening here, and now to what extent are we willing to interrupt it? So sometimes folks who position themselves as allies can be worse. So it's really around saying, okay, what is this for? And I am never speaking for people, right? Mm-hmm. Because what white supremacy likes to do is they like to pull you out as the researcher and say, now can you talk to us about what's happening? The rule must be, you do not enter the mouth of the lion by yourself. Right? You are always with the folks that you are working with, right? So now you are presenting a collective voice in opposed to this kind of nuanced researcher that they are now positioning you as. So now you're saying something different, right? You are literally interrupting and saying, look, we can't do this from a space where I'm positioned as the expert, right? I think for allies, even more so than folks who don't know, we have to be willing to suspend our expertise, right? We are not experts in a space that we have been brought to, right? We have much more to learn.
I think you hit two incredibly important points. And the one about listening and authentic listening and paying attention, those three pieces are absolutely fundamental. And sometimes it appears that educators are reluctant to allow themselves to be the listening learner. And that's a source of error in many questions, in many issues, I should say, in many places. One of the questions, when I saw the question, I said, okay, this is one of those wife beater questions. And because the question goes, how have higher education institutions managed to diversify and accomplish this business of addressing structural racism and systemic racism,
right?
Or structural sexism and systemic sexism.
Right. I would say that I would not count university successes at this particular moment, right? I think some folks have been intentional, and that intentionality has put folks on particular pathways, but I think we would be remiss to claim success, right? I think that people have been intentional around saying, here's how we have participated in this, and here's what we're doing to address it. But I'm thinking about, there's a community engagement project at the University of Virginia in Charlottesville. And one of the things that they talked about was, and I thought it was really important, They said before the Charlottesville uprisings, before the death and further subjugation of people, we understand that the University of Virginia has not been an ally to the community of Charlottesville.
Right.
I thought that was a really important piece, right? To state that clearly. And now to say, here's what we're willing to do to engage in authentic redress and begin to put our resources in this space that is not just dependent on the faculty person, but also that is dependent and actually engaged as part of a permanent budget of the University of Virginia. I think those things really become important. So the litmus is who is willing to put up resources, who is willing to make spaces sustainable, and then now how is that working? How do you recognize it as ongoing work, right? Because if we're not careful, you know, everybody, so now if we think about the DEI explosion, right? Diversity, equity, and inclusion,
Right.
right? You know, we got to be clear about this. You know, sometimes you could have folks in these positions and it equates to being vice provost of the fax machine. I mean, like it's these nothing spots, like, because it's like you see folks and they get hired and they don't even have a staff. I'm like, wait,
True.
You got a university that's got 40,000 students and you're the N of one. What is the expectation?
Right.
Right. So this thing around really thinking about, I don't think universities have engaged this successfully. I think some folks have been more forthright in their struggle to do it.
Okay.
But I think this thing around really being intentional around that has to be clear, because what the university is often unwilling to do is to call its own actions into question because they consider it to be a liability issue. Right. So this thing around, like, so it's like, you know, lawyers talk about this all the time, right? You claim something, you claim you did something, and now you can be sued retroactively, right? So this thing around really thinking about that in real time. And that's what I think a lot of universities still fear.
Let me push you a little bit on the issue of the university and this idea. Help us understand
Brother Trent,
what we're saying. Yes.
We are at 4 minutes before, and I recognize the fire that's happening, and we've got a nice conversation. I don't know, I don't want to take the privilege of the hour, but don't know whether you, Brother Stovall or Brother Trent, have another few minutes and to cap that at a certain time so we're clear.
Yeah, we can, not a problem. We can make this the last question. That's perfect.
If you want to, that's up to you.
I can do it. Thank you so much, Rodney. I was thinking about shooting you a message in chat to ask you, where were we?
I'm not rushing you. I'm sorry. Please
I understand.
Make it clear. I'm not rushing Stowe or you on this. And in the light of the question, can I just get mine in? That is regarding the recent announcement of the first Black president of the SEC, and also at Louisiana State University. Maybe you can contextualize some of this even better, Brother Trent.
Well, first of all, shout out to Brother Tate, William Tate, one for having put himself in a position to be selected for that spot. That's a major step. I think we're all going to have to be in continuous prayer and support for the brother to be successful there. And I don't mean that facetiously, and I don't mean it as humor. I'm speaking seriously, because and it goes at what the question was going to be about, was to ask David to elaborate on this notion of what our challenge, what we're actually challenging when something is structural. And I can do this with David because he's a very good sociologist, and sociologists deal with this notion of structural. So when you can even use William Tate's appointment as president of LSU, is that representative at all? Is that an indicator of a structural change? Or is it an invitation for Bill Tate and an opportunity for Bill Tate to actually begin the challenge of building structural change in that university.
Right. And I think I really equate this to kind of the Obama election, right? Individual successes are not collective victories. And I think it's important for us to understand that, because the United States kind of prides itself on rewarding individualism, right? And I think we have to be clear around what represents a collective victory, right?
Mm-hmm.
So now, and the other part of your question that I hear, Doc, is we now have to think about, you know, the abolitionists were right, right? So this thing around, or I should say the abolitionists are right, right? I think the thing is really understanding that you now have a particular responsibility in working to dismantle those structures and systems that you have seen do this damage.
Right.
Right. And I think it's really important to begin. And even then, it's still only a first step. So if we think about the sister who became president of Brown in the early 2000s,
right?
She just said, look, we know who Paul Brown was, right? We know what he was. He was a slaver. He made his money off the backs of enslaved, captured, and kidnapped Africans. And here's what we're going to do for and thanks, Theophilus Brown, Ruth Simmons, right? So now she said, here's what we're going to do to make sure that we provide redress. And I really appreciate the statement that she made, because she said, this is only a small step to redress.
Right.
So I think about this understanding around, now there's an opportunity to address some things. Is it a fail-safe solution? Absolutely not. But we should now think about now what is, you know, and this is, you know, we become historians of our own struggle, right? So this is what I read into this around what Huey Newton was talking about in terms of revolutionary suicide, right? So he made this point around, we are willing to end the practices because what we're doing is actually cleansing the self and saying, look, we're engaging in this practice, and this practice is going to have a ton of bumps in the road. But at the end, we have killed that which has maimed and destroyed, and we have built something different. And I think it's a really important point. So again, abolitionists like Bettina Love, Miriam Kaba, Savannah Shange, you know, folks who come from this Black queer radical tradition, they're saying, look, we need to be clear about what these things can be in terms of redress, right? So if you think about Bill Tate's hire, the more important thing is, who does Bill Tate have on his team? Right? So how does he build out the capacity of those folks, right? And that team got to be big, and that team got to be strong, because you are in the SEC, you are in football country, you are in a whole different world. And this is where white supremacy is understood as the norm, right? If you're not running, if you're not catching touchdowns or hitting quarterbacks or putting a ball through a basket, them white folks ain't trying to see you. So now you have to be clear about that. So now what Tate's work is going to be is to build out that team, and that team gotta be hard, and he gotta be willing to clean house and really confront that heavy booster alumni system that gives LSU millions of dollars per year, right? So this thing, and you know, we got an interesting history, right? Remember when King Alexander was the president, right? And I remember I was on a panel with King Alexander, and I was just like, hey man, look, this is a whole different thing. And he looked at me in the face and said, Yo, yeah. I knew I had an idea what this was, but it's a completely different thing. So now the work is, and that goes back to the collective work. How do we build out teams of people to address this collectively? Because the individual success is only this success in relationship to capitalism.
Right.
That's not a collective victory. That's not doing right by the people of Baton Rouge. This thing is really around build out that team to hold folks to account. So now you can think about the work differently. And actually, there's a brother down there at LSU who does this type of work. And he becomes critically important in terms of how we now begin to think about this, because his work, he says, look, I know what this is, and here's how I'm willing to build out this work. So shout to Roland Mitchell. What Roland always does is he says, look, I know what this is. My responsibility is to build that team strong. And now as I built that team strong, here's what we're willing to do. So he always thinks about his work collectively. And he also thinks about his work around, he is not fearful of the movements of white supremacy. His thing is always, look, we have to be clear around what it is that we're trying to do. I know that as soon as I've put this into the ether, they're going to come, right? And they're going to come for me, but I'm not fearful of that. I'm going to do it because it needs to be done. So, shouts and blessings to Brother Tate, but he got to build that team strong, because if he doesn't, it is still that individual success and not a collective victory.
I have to do two things, David, as we close. One is to tell you that you just answered one of the critical questions that folks had. And that was a question seeking wisdom on how to find an action team and build links between faculty responsibilities and social justice actions. So you in many ways addressed that. And then the last thing is, we want to give a shout out to you. This has been tremendous. And we thank you for coming home and sharing your experiences with us, and being willing to do it so genuinely to help us understand the challenges that remain, the things we need to continue to do as a university or as a department that continues to try to develop people who will feel the necessity of addressing these continuing problems and challenges. So thank you. I don't want to get into any more trouble, Brother Hobson. Not that he was suggesting that we were. Any final thoughts, comments that you want to leave with us, David?
Man, I just think, again, truly, truly thankful for being able to be in community with folks today. And note that I'm saying this not as a person necessarily with answers, but as a person who's operating as a struggling educator, right? So the same thing that we're talking about today, I'm still struggling with, but I think today was more around a reflection, my reflections on this thing and how I've tried to navigate through it, trying to maintain a commitment to abolition and a commitment to fugitivity.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Just want to shout out.
Thank you.
Just want to shout out and say a big thank you. This series has been brought primarily through the College of Education Dean's Distinguished Lecture Series, thanks to CREA, OCCRL, Office of the Advancement, Office of the Dean, and other moderators and supporters of this event. We look forward to doing the work, and a special thank you to Prof. Trent and Prof. Stovall.
Definitely.
Happy to be here, Hob.
Yeah, thank y'all so much.
David, please continue to keep it up. Anything we can do to encourage and support the work you're doing, just let us know.
Indeed, all the time. Thank y'all again.
All right. Yep. All right.